He was the symbol of honor, the man everyone turned to in their darkest moments. Captain John Reynolds, a decorated officer of the state troopers, known for his unwavering commitment to justice. But behind the uniform was a dangerous secret, one he would kill to keep hidden. In the end, the very man trusted to protect the truth became the architect of a terrible crime. What drove a man of his stature to cross the line? What was the secret he was so desperate to bury? And how did his betrayal unravel an entire community? This is a story of trust shattered, lives destroyed, and the lengths someone will go to protect their shadowed past. The answers will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about loyalty and justice. Captain John Reynolds was the epitome of honor. A man who wore his badge with pride, he spent decades serving the community. Known for his calm leadership and impeccable record, he was a figure people looked up to, a protector, a mentor, and a hero in the eyes of his town. Then there was Melissa Carter. Bright, relentless, and fearless. As a young journalist, she had a knack for uncovering stories others were too afraid to touch. Her determination had earned her both admiration and enemies. But when Melissa stumbled onto a secret she was never meant to find, her life took a dangerous turn. In a quiet town where trust ran deep and faces were familiar. A place where people left their doors unlocked and waved to Captain Reynolds as he passed by. But beneath the surface of this peaceful facade lay the seeds of corruption, and Melissa was determined to bring it to light. When Melissa went missing, her colleagues and loved ones sounded the alarm. It seemed unthinkable that someone so full of life could vanish without a trace. But as investigators began retracing her steps, they found hints of a much larger story, one that tied her disappearance to a local corruption case. And at the center of it all, a name no one expected, Captain John Reynolds. What could be so damaging, so dangerous, that it pushed a respected officer to cross a line no one thought he'd ever approach? What secret was Melissa Carter on the verge of exposing? And how far would someone go to ensure it stayed hidden? On the night of October 14, Melissa Carter left her apartment for what she thought would be a routine meeting. She had told a colleague earlier that day she was close to a breakthrough, something big, something that could shake the town to its core. The person she was meeting was a confidential source, someone she trusted, someone who promised her the final piece of the puzzle she'd been working on for months. But Melissa never returned home that night. Her car was found hours later, abandoned on a desolate stretch of road just outside of town. The keys were still in the ignition, but her phone was missing. To the untrained eye, it looked as though she had simply vanished into thin air. But investigators knew better. This wasn't just a case of a missing person, there was something deeply wrong. The first question was obvious: where was Melissa Carter? But as they delved deeper, the more urgent question became, who had the most to gain from her silence? The initial stages of the investigation were chaotic. Friends and family described Melissa as a cautious person, someone who wouldn't have taken unnecessary risks. But as detectives began to retrace her steps, they discovered she had recently been working on an exposé, a story tied to corruption within the town's leadership. Her notes, recovered from her laptop, hinted at connections between local officials and criminal enterprises. They were incomplete, fragmented, but alarming enough to suggest that Melissa's disappearance wasn't random. At first, suspicion turned toward known figures in the criminal underworld. Melissa had a reputation for getting too close to dangerous people in pursuit of the truth. Had one of them decided she was too much of a threat? Or perhaps, someone close to her? Friends, colleagues, even a former boyfriend were scrutinized under the harsh light of suspicion. But one by one, each of these leads hit a dead end. Alibis were confirmed, motives unraveled, and the trail went cold, until an unexpected witness came forward. The witness, whose identity remains protected to this day, claimed to have seen something unusual on the night of Melissa's disappearance. A car, parked on that same desolate road, matching the description of a vehicle registered to none other than Captain John Reynolds. At first, this revelation seemed unthinkable. Reynolds was a man whose reputation had been untouchable for decades. But as investigators began to look closer, inconsistencies in his story began to emerge. Why couldn't he account for his whereabouts during those crucial hours? Why had he suddenly taken an extended leave just days after Melissa's disappearance? And, most damning of all, why did his name appear in Melissa's private notes, circled, underlined, and connected to the very corruption she was investigating? At first, these questions were met with disbelief. Captain Reynolds had been the town's hero, a symbol of integrity. But as the evidence slowly began to mount, a darker picture started to emerge. Investigators realized that this wasn't just a story about a missing journalist. This was about power, manipulation, and a man desperate to protect secrets he thought would never come to light. To anyone who knew Captain John Reynolds, he seemed like the embodiment of everything a law enforcement officer should be. A devoted family man, he spent his weekends coaching his son's little league games and attending church services with his wife. In the community, he was a figure of trust, a steady hand during crises, the kind of person neighbors greeted with admiration and respect. His professional life was just as polished. With a career spanning over 2 decades, Reynolds had earned countless commendations for his service and had been promoted to captain of the state troopers, a position many believed he truly deserved. But behind the carefully curated image of a hero lay a far more complex and dangerous reality. While Reynolds was shaking hands at town hall meetings and patrolling the streets as a symbol of justice, he was also hiding a secret, a double life that would eventually lead to murder. Melissa Carter's investigation began to pull back the curtain on that secret, and what she uncovered was shocking. Through months of digging, Melissa had pieced together evidence of a shadowy network operating within the town. At first, it appeared to be your typical corruption story, local officials accepting bribes, illegal deals being made under the table. But as she followed the money trail, Melissa discovered connections to something far more serious, drug trafficking. And at the heart of this network, to her astonishment, was Captain Reynolds. Reynolds had used his position of power to protect and expand the operations of a criminal syndicate. His spotless record and position as a trusted authority made him the perfect shield for illicit activities. He ensured that investigations into key players never gained traction, evidence quietly disappeared, and patrol schedules conveniently overlooked certain shipments. But for Melissa, the real breakthrough came when she discovered documentation linking Reynolds directly to the operation, phone records, financial transactions, and coded messages that pointed to his involvement. Melissa's notes also revealed she had uncovered something even more damning, evidence of direct orders from Reynolds to silence potential threats to the operation. These weren't just accusations of corruption. They were accusations of conspiracy and cover-ups that could destroy not only Reynolds' career but his entire life. For someone like him, a man whose reputation was everything, this was a threat he couldn't afford to ignore. The deeper Melissa dug, the closer she got to uncovering the full scope of Reynolds' criminal activities. And the closer she got, the more dangerous her work became. Her notes were clear, she knew her investigation was putting her in harm's way. But she couldn't stop. What Melissa didn't know was just how far Reynolds was willing to go to keep his secret safe. Her findings didn't just expose corruption, they directly implicated Captain John Reynolds in a conspiracy that would rock the town to its core. And then, just like that, Melissa Carter vanished. On the night of her disappearance, Melissa Carter believed she was meeting a source who could provide the final piece of her story. She had been cautious, as always, sharing her plans with a colleague earlier that day and keeping her notes with her at all times. But what she didn't know was that the source she was heading to meet wasn't who they claimed to be. Captain John Reynolds had learned of Melissa's investigation through an informant within his network. He was aware of the evidence she had collected and knew that if her story went public, it would spell the end of his career, his family life, and potentially his freedom. Desperation pushed him into action. This wasn't an impulsive decision, it was cold, calculated, and planned down to the smallest detail. Reynolds used a burner phone to contact Melissa, posing as someone connected to her story, someone with access to the critical information she needed. He arranged a meeting in a remote location, far from prying eyes. For Melissa, it was just another step toward completing her work. For Reynolds, it was the perfect trap. When Melissa arrived at the secluded spot, a desolate stretch of woods miles outside of town, Reynolds was waiting. The exact details of what happened next may never be fully known, but forensic evidence would later reveal chilling clues. It appeared Melissa had realized too late that something was wrong. Scuff marks near her car indicated a brief struggle. The autopsy would later show signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting she was struck before being overpowered. Reynolds, a man who had spent decades enforcing the law, now found himself covering up the ultimate crime. He used his extensive knowledge of investigative procedures to stage the scene. Melissa's body was carefully concealed in an area far from the location of her car, ensuring that the two sites would initially appear unrelated. He wiped down any potential evidence from the vehicle, leaving behind only faint traces that would later become critical to solving the case. He then planted false leads to divert suspicion. Melissa's phone, which had been taken from her car, was later found in a different location, suggesting she might have fled or been abducted by someone else. Reynolds had even gone as far as creating fake entries in his police log, documenting patrols in entirely different parts of town to establish an alibi. Every step of the way, he relied on his training and his position of authority to stay one step ahead of the investigation. But no crime is perfect, and Reynolds made a crucial mistake, one he didn't even realize at the time. In his haste to cover his tracks, he overlooked a seemingly insignificant detail. Melissa had sent a text message to a trusted friend just moments before she arrived at the meeting location. The message was simple, "Here now. Looks legit." It was a small clue, but it placed her at the exact spot Reynolds had lured her to. And it was enough to begin unraveling the web of deception he had worked so hard to construct. The forensic evidence didn't stop there. Investigators later discovered traces of Melissa's blood in the trunk of a vehicle registered to Reynolds. Fibers from her clothing were found on his jacket, and GPS data from his phone betrayed his movements that night, placing him near both the crime scene and the location where her body was eventually discovered. One by one, the pieces began to fall into place. Reynolds had spent years using his knowledge of the law to evade suspicion and maintain his double life. But now, the very systems he had once controlled were turning against him. And as investigators closed in, it became clear that the captain of the state troopers wasn't just a protector of the law, he was its most dangerous enemy. For weeks, the investigation seemed to be heading nowhere. Melissa's disappearance had left the community shaken, but there was little to go on. Leads dried up, and even her closest friends began to fear they might never find answers. But as with so many cases, it was a combination of persistence and a single break that turned everything around. That break came from a witness, a local hunter who had been out in the woods on the night Melissa vanished. The hunter hadn't thought much of the vehicle he saw parked off a remote dirt road. But when the story of Melissa's disappearance began dominating the news, he realized the vehicle matched the description of the captain's personal car. At first, he hesitated to come forward. After all, who would dare accuse the highly respected Captain Reynolds? But his conscience wouldn't let him remain silent. His statement marked the beginning of Reynolds' undoing. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered another piece of critical evidence. Surveillance footage from a gas station just a few miles from the meeting location showed Reynolds filling up his car late that evening. The timestamp placed him in the area at the exact time Melissa had sent her final text message. This footage directly contradicted his carefully constructed alibi, which claimed he had been responding to a minor traffic incident on the other side of town. But the most damning evidence came from the lab. Forensic analysis of the items recovered from the crime scene revealed DNA traces that couldn't be ignored. A small, bloodied rock found near where Melissa's body was discovered contained DNA from both Melissa and Reynolds. Further tests linked fibers from Melissa's clothing to Reynolds' uniform. And then there was the murder weapon, a blunt object investigators believed was used to strike Melissa. Though it had been wiped clean, microscopic traces of Reynolds' fingerprints remained, along with residue that matched debris found at the scene. The case against Reynolds grew stronger when investigators reviewed Melissa's notes. Her meticulous records painted a damning picture, detailing her discovery of Reynolds' ties to a criminal network. In her final entries, she described receiving threats, warnings to back off the story. She had written one name, Jr. At the time, it had seemed like a cryptic code, but now, it was clear. John Reynolds. With every piece of evidence, the walls were closing in. Reynolds, confident in his ability to manipulate the system, had underestimated the investigators' determination. They pieced together the timeline, using Melissa's notes and the forensic evidence to connect him directly to the crime. Every loose thread was tied into a web that pointed squarely at him. The turning point came during a public ceremony, an event meant to honor Reynolds for his decades of service. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered, unaware of what was about to unfold. As Reynolds stood on stage, flanked by his peers, detectives arrived with a warrant for his arrest. In front of a stunned audience, Reynolds was handcuffed and led away. The crowd, once filled with admiration, fell silent. The man they had trusted and revered was now exposed as a murderer. It was a dramatic moment, one that would be seared into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. For the community, it was a betrayal of the deepest kind. For the investigators, it was the culmination of weeks of relentless work. And for Reynolds, it was the beginning of the end. The trial of Captain John Reynolds captivated the nation. Courtrooms are often a stage for truth and justice, but in this case, they also became a theater of raw emotion, strategy, and, ultimately, reckoning. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They presented a detailed timeline of the night Melissa disappeared, meticulously reconstructing her final hours. Surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and Melissa's notes painted a damning portrait of Reynolds as a man who had everything to lose, and was willing to kill to protect his secrets. The prosecutors highlighted how his position as a law enforcement officer gave him unique knowledge of how to manipulate crime scenes, avoid detection, and intimidate witnesses. They emphasized the betrayal. A man sworn to protect the public had used his power to cover up a heinous act. The most emotional moments came from the testimonies of Melissa's family and colleagues. Her mother, tearful yet composed, spoke of Melissa's passion for uncovering the truth and her dreams of making a difference. Her voice broke as she described the void left in their lives, a pain that no sentence could ever heal. Colleagues recounted her determination, her courage, and how she had confided in them about the threats she'd received. Each testimony was a reminder of the bright future Reynolds had stolen. Reynolds' defense was equally intense but ultimately unconvincing. His legal team argued that he was the victim of a conspiracy, that his name had been falsely implicated by those seeking to protect their own involvement in the corruption Melissa had uncovered. They pointed fingers at others in the department and suggested that the evidence had been planted. Reynolds himself took the stand, maintaining his innocence with a calm demeanor that cracked only briefly under cross-examination. But the prosecution delivered the final blow during rebuttal. Unbeknownst to the defense, investigators had uncovered an audio recording from Melissa's phone. Though heavily damaged, forensic specialists had recovered enough to identify a critical piece of evidence, Reynolds' voice, captured during their final meeting. The chilling line, "You should have left this alone," echoed in the courtroom. It was unmistakable. For the jury, it was the nail in the coffin. Then came the moment no one expected. During a particularly heated cross-examination, Reynolds faltered. Under pressure from the prosecution, he made a stunning admission. While he didn't explicitly confess to the murder, his words implied guilt. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," he muttered, a moment of weakness that sent ripples through the courtroom. It was a crack in his carefully crafted facade, one that the jury couldn't ignore. When the verdict was read, the room was heavy with anticipation. "Guilty of first-degree murder," the foreperson announced. The decision was unanimous. As the sentence was delivered, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Melissa's family wept openly, clutching each other in both sorrow and relief. Reynolds showed little emotion, his gaze fixed on the floor. The once revered captain was now a convicted killer, his name synonymous with betrayal and deceit. Outside the courthouse, the community grappled with the fallout. For some, there was relief that justice had been served. For others, there was lingering disbelief that a man they had admired could fall so far. But one thing was certain, the truth had prevailed, and Melissa's legacy as a fearless journalist would endure. Reynolds, now confined to a cell, serves as a chilling reminder that power and respectability can sometimes conceal the darkest of secrets. His fall from grace was complete, his legacy forever tarnished. The story of Captain John Reynolds and Melissa Carter is more than a tale of crime and betrayal, it is a tragedy that speaks to the darkest corners of power, trust, and human nature. Melissa Carter was a young journalist with a fierce commitment to uncovering the truth. She believed that shining a light on corruption could bring change, even in the face of danger. Her work exposed the hidden rot beneath the surface of authority, but it came at the ultimate cost. She lost her life for daring to reveal what others sought to keep hidden. Yet, her courage has left an indelible mark, a legacy of fearlessness in pursuit of justice. For the community that once held Captain Reynolds in high regard, the betrayal cut deep. This was a man they had trusted to protect them, a man who had worn the badge with pride and commanded respect. To discover that he had exploited that trust, and even used his position to commit and conceal the most unforgivable crime, shook the very foundation of their beliefs. Many were left asking, if someone like Reynolds could fall so far, who else might be hiding behind a facade of respectability? As the dust settled, Melissa's colleagues and family worked to honor her memory. Her investigative work inspired reforms in local law enforcement, ensuring greater accountability and transparency. While the changes came too late to save Melissa, they stood as a testament to the power of her work. Her bravery became a rallying cry for journalists everywhere, to keep asking questions, to keep seeking the truth, no matter the cost. But this case leaves us with a haunting question: how many more secrets like this remain buried? How many more lives are affected by the silent whispers of those who abuse their power, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them? Melissa was that person, an ordinary young woman with an extraordinary sense of purpose. But the world needs more like her. The tragedy of Melissa Carter and the downfall of Captain Reynolds remind us of two things. First, the truth always has a way of coming to light. And second, those who dare to pursue it, even in the face of unimaginable danger, have the power to change the world. What are your thoughts on the case of Captain John Reynolds? Could Melissa's fate have been avoided if someone had acted sooner? Or were the layers of deception too deep to uncover in time? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear your perspective. And if you found this story as compelling as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who are fascinated by cases that reveal the complex intersections of power, trust, and betrayal. Your support helps us continue to uncover stories like this. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming cases. Each one reveals a new layer of the unexpected truths lurking beneath the surface. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, truth has a way of finding its voice, no matter how deeply it's buried.